All right, so there are two things you'll notice immediately in today's laser update. The first is a giant notification.
The gist of it is that experimental audio, that's on by default for everyone, so audio latency is lower. Whenever I talk about latency, I find it very hard to convey it to users. The time between when you click and a hit sound plays is less. If you're a player which your brain works based on the audio feedback you're getting from hit sounds, then this is going to be a game-changing change. If you are someone that works more on the visuals and reading the approach circles, then this may not actually be noticeable to you. Anyone that has been using experimental audio will be aware of this, but you had to adjust your global offset to make it work well. We've actually applied that adjustment internally in the game now, so anyone that was using it now has that adjustment applied to their audio offset automatically, which means that if you look at settings, your global offset is now going to be different to what you had it set to. And the dialogue was our way of being like, it's fine, that change was made intentionally, don't touch it.
The second thing you'll notice immediately in today's laser update affects really all OS players since the beginning of time. Scores have been updated with new mod multipliers, which are the numbers you see in the corner whenever selecting a mod. Changes here have been in the works for a while. In January, a survey came out asking people for their opinions on certain mods. After the survey closed, some score nerds analyzed the data and came to a consensus on the most accurate multiplier for each mod. Then developers set up server infrastructure to non-destructively adjust 19 years worth of scores. Once everything was ready, a news article was published explaining the new multipliers, and at the same time, Peppy ran score recalculations, reindexing, and that one's today.
Want me to talk about infrastructure? I'll talk about infrastructure all day.
Before letting Peppy rant about servers, we should cover what OS players actually care about, which mod multipliers are changing and why they're changing. So I spoke with one of those score nerds, Tsunyoku, about exactly that. Let's start with, what multiplier changes do you think will affect the average player?
Well, the most important was definitely the classic mod. Classic is the only case where mod multipliers have changed for any rule set that is not OS. We changed Taiko, Catch, and Mania to just a one multiplier. The OS rule set increased slightly. A couple of factors went into that. People voted for between 0.98 and to 0.99, and also we did comparisons on replays by playing them back in both clients and seeing what multiplier you would need to favor a certain client, and the one we've chosen is the closest to being fair between the two clients. Historically, Hidden and Hard Rock have always had the same multiplier. People generally regard Hard Rock to being harder in most circumstances, and leaderboards just don't look as good when Hidden and Hard Rock are on equal footing. So Hidden was slightly decreased and Hard Rock was increased by quite a bit.
Yeah, I saw Hidden players were kind of mad about this one.
There is definitely a subsection of Hidden players that dislike it, but people voted for these new multipliers. And even amongst Hidden players, Hard Rock was going to win anyways. You're never going to have everyone agree to it, right? Double time was 1.1, it is now 1.23. On stable leaderboards, just as an example, people have always felt multiplier difference between Hard Rock and DT was not good enough, especially if you were playing DT without Hidden. You could see Hidden Hard Rock scores always scoring above. That shouldn't really be the case anymore. Easy is a very interesting mod because it is technically a difficulty reduction mod, but in practice, most people play worse with it because the density is very high. Obviously, it doesn't make sense to make it more rewarding, and the survey results reflect that, but it got increased from 0.5 to 0.8, so that's also pretty significant. Other than that, a lot of the other mods that I would mention are probably fun mods, but I don't want to go too deep into that.
Okay, let's talk about how these numbers were actually chosen. So I know you're part of this score committee thing. How does that actually work?
The general intention was to try and get a group of people who one way or another had experience either with score or just the general care for leaderboards. Like Maklovitz, for example, is number one on the ranked score leaderboards. Ziff has a lot of experience with the math behind scoring. There's people that feel pretty strongly about the legacy of old scores, and then there's people invested in Lazer's future, and it worked pretty well. Ultimately, the main driving factor was the survey. We basically took out the bottom 25% and the top 25%, and then we averaged what's left. And then everyone else got on a call, went through all of those results for hours, and we have a final sheet, which was every individual person deciding their own multipliers based off of the survey results, averaged those out, discussed any that were wildly different, and those were the final numbers.
So the survey and basically all the changes were only for one mode. Why not change mod multipliers in other modes too?
We didn't want to poll all of the rule sets in one go. Most people probably only play one or two rule sets actively, but there should be future polls to ask similar questions for the other rule sets so that we can refine their multipliers as well.
Okay, I have one more question. As far as I know, these multipliers only affect laser. Why are they not also unstable?
Two reasons. The shorter reason of the two is stable being feature locked. That has been the case for a long time. But second of all, any multipliers that we come up with for lazer, if you put them into the stable scoring system, it just would not work. Fundamentally, score v1 and score v3 are very different scoring systems. And with how lazer's scoring system works, multipliers are generally higher to achieve similar results. And trying to reflect that by copying them over would just not work. So it just made sense to focus on the lazer client.
Okay, fine. Peppy can talk about infrastructure now.
But I spent like the last 2 weeks on infrastructure to make mod multiplier changes work. This is the ongoing run of indexing, which is going through every score and making sure they're in the correct order after we've already applied the score multiplier changes themselves. We are currently at 2.89 billion scores in the new scores table. At first I was like, oh, only laser scores. Well, that's a fraction of the total scores. It'll take no time at all and we can just apply it. Turns out that it also applies to every score with classic mod, which is every stable score, which is, a lot of scores. One of the first steps was like, okay, any score which has mods applied, we kind of want to save the base score, the no multiplier score. The reasoning for that is that this may not be the last time we applied mod multiplier changes. So future proofing, we want to store that base score so that every time we change the multipliers, we don't do this division and then remultiplication, because every time you do that step, you're losing floating point accuracy. So scores could change by 1 or 2 points, or maybe more for a big score. Anyway, we tried to store these total score without multipliers, and it turned out to start ballooning the database table size. So we stopped doing that before everything fell over, and that's where I decided to I basically rebuilt our database backend from scratch. So now they have, instead of 2 terabytes disk space, they have 4 point something, and we've got all this space to do all this stuff which I wish I could have done for the last 5 years, like fixing tables. Every time you need to fix a table, you need double the disk space so you can write a new copy of the table and move over to it. I guess what I can say is that we have everything in place now to make multiplier changes happen in almost no time. We will never need to put a month aside to make this happen again.
This whole reworking infrastructure for future efficiency thing might sound familiar to anyone who's been following laser updates for a long time. Nearly 2 years ago, Peppy did something similar for changes to star rating and performance points.
I made a lot of improvements to the efficiency of the reprocessing of scores. I think that's time well spent because it means that in the future we can actually run things pretty fast.
That's also why one of those is happening in less than a week, with details to be explained in a front page news post. And because Sunyoku is also part of the PP committee, I asked, out of all the coming PP changes, which do you find most significant?
I don't think it's a secret that in the past sort of year, there has been a very big uptake in these light core and cut version jump maps that give a lot of PP for not a huge amount of difficulty. So there is a new nerf for repeated acute angle jumps that just scales by how continually repetitive they are. Another thing is, up until now, difficulty has always just been aim and speed, but we have now introduced a new reading skill that tries to assess difficulty using density. Maps like Heat Abnormal get a sizable buff now. People who played the easy mod a lot will see a lot of buffs, and generally a lot of scores at the very high rankings. I'm talking top 1%. We'll see some nerfs from this because the previous AR bonuses scaled by difficulty, so it would just get more and more broken the higher you went in PP. Yeah.
Speaking of top players, I saw the new PP record from just a couple days ago is getting a major nerf. Could you explain what's going on with that?
Yes. Part of the speed skill is rhythm difficulty. There was a bug where, in the case of Cellar of Ghosts, there was a stream with a note snapped onto a timing change, and that single note was essentially adding between 100 to 200 pp. So now what it does is if there's only a single note change, there's just a constant difficulty applied rather than it trying to buff the whole pattern. It affects very few maps in practice, but the ones that it does affect are pretty bad.
That's enough about PP for now. You can wait till the news post to learn the rest of what's changed. As far as lazer is concerned, the majority of development time since the last update has gone into that infrastructure we were talking about, but today's lazer release still has some stuff to show. In the editor, you can now add background videos from the Setup tab. There are shortcuts for external editing and uploading maps. On the left sidebar, different game modes have mode-specific icons now. And on the other sidebar, there's a new slider velocity box, letting mappers finally change slider velocity before placing an object. This is how most mappers are used to doing it, so it's a pretty nice feature. Then over in Song Select, pressing F3 will now toggle the options menu instead of just weirdly reopening it. In multiple places, these video and storyboard icons are now bigger. Ranked play now has proper sound effects for these damage indicators. And in multiplayer lobbies, the concept of slots from stable is now part of lazer.
We're trying to fill in the remaining gaps to make it possible for more tournaments to use lazer. And one of those gaps was just having slots in a multiplayer game. So to use this, you can choose to limit the maximum players up to 16. And in that range, you actually get slots coming back. Anything more than 16 doesn't do slots because they kind of get unmanageable at that point anyway. Did you see I shot a survey out to all the OWC players of last year to see if they were willing to play on lazer?
I did, but based on the responses, I probably don't want to talk about that in the video.
No, it's probably best not to piss more people off right now. We're in a good state of not having many people pissed off at us in recent days. I won't say months.